Assalamu alaikum. I am Talha Al-Ali. Thank you for being here for this first full episode of Decolonized Minds podcast. In the trailer, we touched on the urgency of this work. Today, we step into Chapter 1, the Colonial Mind. To understand the colonial mind, we have to accept that colonization is not a metaphor. It is the act of recovering what was buried, restoring what was distorted, and remembering what we were told to forget, or what we have been forced to forget. I often return to Edward Said, who wrote, "Exile is strangely compelling to think about, but terrible to experience. An unhealable rift between a person and their home." Now think about it for a second. For many of us, and many of our clients, that exile is not only geographical. It lives internally. It shapes how we see ourselves and what we come to accept as normal. In this episode, we will stay with three main ideas: mental occupation, psychiatry as a mechanism of control, and the rewilding of the psychological landscape. Let's elaborate on mental occupation first. When we speak of colonialism, we usually think of land, borders, extraction. While it's true, one of its most enduring forms is what I call mental occupation. What does that actually mean? It is the implantation of foreign systems of thought that reshape how people understand themselves and their communities and the world. Imagine a software update forced into a system that wasn't built to run it. The original files, ancestral knowledge, communal rituals, ways of relating to the land and each other aren't just ignored. Over time, they are overwritten. You still function, but something fundamental has shifted. This shows up in the foundations of modern psychology and psychiatry. Most global mental health systems are structured through North American and European epistemologies, ways of knowing that can marginalize or pathologize other worldviews. Now let me bring this into the room. I once sat with a client who spoke about visitations from her deceased mother. In a standard Western assessment, this might quickly be flagged, screened as hallucinations, something to evaluate and contain and maybe medicalize, or most likely medicalize. That's the mental occupation in action actually. The training becomes the default authority. This Western epistemology becomes the only way of dealing with this client. In a different space, we start elsewhere. We ask, what does this mean to you? What does this connection hold? How does it anchor your grief? How does it anchor your relation with your mother, with your deceased mother? And that shift, small as it sounds, is part of a radical unlearning. Not discarding knowledge, but loosening its grip, peeling back the layers of European and Western bias embedded in everything, from our psychometric instruments to the structure of the therapy room to the structure of the power in the therapy room. Who's the expert of this woman's life? It's herself. And this makes us move to psychiatry as a mechanism of control. If we're being honest, psychiatry hasn't always been about healing. In many colonial contexts, it functioned as a mechanism of control. Frantz Fanon wrote about this in The Wretched of the Earth, describing how psychiatric institutions in colonial Algeria were used to contain those seen as disruptive. If you resisted the colonial order, you were pathologized. Resistance itself, the very natural thing that all species on Earth would do when they are threatened, could be labeled as psychological deviance. That logic doesn't disappear. It shifts forms. We still see traces of it in how Western psychiatry acts as gatekeeper of healing. Frameworks like the DSM and ICD standardize care, but they also carry unacknowledged legacies of colonial logics, prioritizing individualism and biological objectivity, often at the expense of communal mourning or spiritual connection, or the cultural way of dealing with hardship. And here, I'd like to pause for a second, because I'm thinking of a young man I worked with in a detention center in Libya. He had been described by previous clinicians as uncooperative and non-compliant. He wouldn't engage. I mean, why would he? Wouldn't really complete standard symptoms checklist. Wouldn't open up. From one angle, that reads as resistance to treatment. From another, it's something else entirely. It was a survival intelligence. A person who had been processed, documented, questioned again and again and again by systems of power. His silence wasn't absence, it was a boundary. His refusal to hand over his inner world to a therapist he sees as an extension of authority and power that have been suppressing him to a therapist he didn't yet trust was a rational response to irrational conditions. In that space, the work wasn't to make him speak. It was to recognize what the room already held, the political reality of the room, and to earn trust slowly, without assumptions. And to think about all the suffering this person went through and was subjected to by systems of powers and authorities. The very normal thing you would do if you was in his place is to not trust power and to be scared of authority and to resist authority. However, there's another part that we need to focus on as well, which is the cultural amnesia. And I'll let this sit with you for a minute. Think about it. And then we will move to the cultural amnesia and double consciousness. One of the deep wounds of the colonial mind is cultural amnesia. Colonization did not only take the land, it disrupted memory, language, continuity. Languages themselves were criminalized. You'd be punished for using your own language under French colonialism, for example. Histories were erased. Nations were erased. Look at Namibia, for example, the first genocide in the 20th century. Almost 80% of the population was massacred by Germany. Their skulls are still in Germany because their scientists wanted to study evolution on the skulls of the people of Namibia. Now I'll move to what W.E.B. Du Bois described as the double consciousness, the experience of seeing yourself through the lens of a world that devalues you. That split doesn't begin within the individual. It's inherited. It's reinforced. It's lived. And sometimes we see this in what's often called intergenerational trauma. Not as a single event, but as something carried through families, through silence, through what is and isn't spoken, and through rules and regulations, and through laws and segregation. Even biologically, research into epigenetics point to how stress responses can be encoded in our DNA and passed across generations. For some of my clients, the ache they feel doesn't begin with them. It is the generational echo of erasure. Now, when you think about it, some people might think that passed down trauma will change you, will change how you look, will change the mutilation of your DNA. Just to give it a small example to illustrate, think about it as a very big piano. This intergenerational trauma is not the piano, it's the pianist. It decides which keys to be played, which keys to be played loud, which keys to be ignored, which keys, when they are pressed, they will evoke the traumatic response, will trigger people, and so on. And I remember working with a young man who described a constant, undefined ache. By most external measures, education, job, income, he was doing very well. But something felt ungrounded. He felt he belonged nowhere. Over time we traced a rupture. His grandparents have been prevented from speaking their native language. That language hadn't been passed down properly. What he internalized as a personal failure, a lack of personality, something missing in himself, began to make sense differently. Not as absence, as interruption. And when he chose to learn that language, it wasn't just educational, it was therapeutic, an act of cultural restoration. Now, if you're listening and you're from an ethnic background, a minority, or a group that have been discriminated or still being discriminated against, colonized, think about your yearning. Ask yourself, what do you yearn for that wasn't really passed down to you properly? What do you like that people see as not normal? And is it your fault or is it their system's fault? And this will move us to rewilding the psychological landscape. If the mind can be occupied, then the question becomes, how do we return? I use the idea of rewilding. In ecology, it's about allowing the land to recover its own balance, not forcing order into it, but creating the conditions for diversity to return, restoring a forest to its natural, unmanaged state. In therapy, it is similar. It means making room for contradiction, for multiple truths, for cultural specificity. It means stepping back from the idea that any single model, including the ones I was trained in, can explain everything to everyone. We draw on different voices here. Arundhati Roy reminds us that the personal and the political are never separate. Guji Wathiango shows how language can be a cultural bomb that erases self-worth and also a medium of resistance. Traditions like the Filipino psychology centers shared identity and interpersonal connectedness, the direct opposite of Western individualism. And sometimes the most important shifts happen in the smallest moments. I remember a Palestinian grandmother who challenged my clinical note. I had written nightmares to describe her sleep. She waved it away and said, "You're writing nightmares. We call it the dreams of return. Even our sleep knows where we belong. Knows we belong in the homes we were kicked out of." For herself, her nightmares were something she held on to remind her that she belongs where she was kicked out of. Rather than disturbed sleep, that was her constant reminder. She wasn't correcting terminology. She was re-narrating her own distress, refusing to let her longing to be turned into a disorder. To conclude this first episode, we need to think of humanity, not heroism. As we close, I want to stay with the role of the therapist. Decolonizing the mind isn't linear. It unsettles things. It asks us to question what we've been trained to trust. It is layered, emotional, and at times profoundly disorientating. It also asks us to let go of certainty, to move away from being the expert in the room and towards being present, attentive, responsive, willing to not fully know, to become a companion rather than a technician. Frantz Fanon spoke about decolonization as something disruptive. And that's the quote I've chose to start my book with. Frantz Fanon, when he said decolonization is always a violent phenomenon, he didn't only mean physical violence. He meant the disruption of narratives and comfort. That disruption isn't abstract. It shows up here in how we listen, how we interrupt, how quickly we name something. But hold in mind as well that this is not a checklist or a blueprint. It is an ongoing conversation, one that shifts depending on the context, on place, on who is in front of us. So the invitation is simple. Stay with it, especially when it becomes uncomfortable. Because if this work doesn't change how we listen, even slightly, then it hasn't gone far enough. This is a collective responsibility to rethink how we train therapists, how we write manuals, how we define evidence, to move beyond mere survivor and towards meaning and community. Thank you for being here. In the next episode, we will move into Chapter 2, Trauma and the Colonized Mind, and stay with how these histories live in the body and across generations.